Israel was a community of people, and salvation, which means wholeness, is a communal thing. If I feel whole, but the only reason I feel whole is because I'm stepping on your back, that's not salvation. That's not actual wholeness. That's my perception of wholeness, but it's actually my selfishness. And so your flourishing and my flourishing together create our communal salvation.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we explore what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Pamela Prickett, a sociologist at the University of Amsterdam.
And I'm your host, Elaine Howard Eklund. I'm a sociologist and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University.
Elaine, we usually don't host episodes together.
That's right, Pamela, but I think we both really wanted to be here to talk to today's guest.
Yes, today we're going to be talking with Gena Thomas. Gena is an author, speaker, and former missionary. Her most recent book, Separated by the Border, tells the story of Julia and her mother Lupe, who were separated on their journey to the United States. It also tells Gena's story, fostering Julia until she could be reunited with her mother.
It's such a pleasure to be here and to talk with you, Gena. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Before we get started formally, I want to set some context for our conversation today by actually taking our listeners back to 2017 and reminding us that under the Trump administration, those suspected of illegally crossing the border, including those crossing for the first time, were criminally prosecuted under a zero-tolerance policy. This means that children who had crossed with their parents or family members were taken into federal custody, resulting in more than 3,000 children being separated from their families. The policy was officially rescinded in January of this year, but it's within this context that our guest Gena Thomas found herself walking closely alongside a child and her mother who had been separated at the border.
So I think we should warn our listeners, right, Elaine, that there will be parts of Lupe's story that are very difficult to hear, including acts of sexual violence. But this is what women face as they migrate to the U.S. And I think it's a really important part of understanding what terms like zero tolerance and family separation really mean on the ground. Gena, let me start by asking why. Why did Lupe want to leave Honduras with Julia?
Yeah, so Lupe had lived with her grandfather and her grandmother for the majority of her life. From the time she was 13, she took care of her grandparents. And so when her grandfather fell ill, they began using up the family savings to pay for his medicine. When those savings ran out, Lupe didn't really know what else to do. She didn't know where to go. Lupe has 4 children, 3 boys and little Julia, the only girl. Julia is the youngest, and so she traveled with Julia to the U.S., thinking the boys could take care of themselves while she was gone for a short amount of time, and she would send money back home as much as possible. And that was the plan. So she really didn't intend on staying very long at all in the United States, just wanted to get enough money for her grandfather.
And what was their journey like?
The journey itself was arduous and traumatic. They started obviously in Honduras and then moved their way up through Guatemala. By the time they got to Mexico, they were traveling in the back of a tractor trailer. So they did this through a coyote, which in their case, this was someone else that they knew had recommended them to be connected to. Lupe knew that there was going to be a lot of risks with this type of travel, but also felt it was the most effective way for her to get to the border. Because her friend, who had previously came with the same coyote, which actually was a coyota because it was a woman smuggler, her friend had come and crossed the border and had no issues. And so Lupe did not think that she would have to deal with what she had to deal with. So when they traveled up, they actually did a couple of different things to secure as much security as they could. One of those things was for Lupe to have a friend, Carlos, put his name on Julia's birth certificate. This was in case anything happened to Lupe. So again, she knew that there were risks, but she wanted to protect her daughter. And in a very patriarchal society, the best way to do that was to have a man's name on her daughter's birth certificate. So that was one thing that they did. And they, oftentimes, I'm not sure in Lupe's case, but oftentimes we hear about women taking birth control on the way up because they know that rape is very common. And in this particular case, it wasn't just rape, it was forced prostitution. Throughout her journey, especially in Mexico, the Coyota had several connections with different nightclubs throughout Mexico. And the group of people that went with her, they would all stop at these different nightclubs along the way. And Lupe was one of the women that they would prostitute out and make more money on the journey north. And so it's not quite clear how often this happened specifically to Lupe, but it happened several times. And then in the border town in northern Mexico, instead of allowing Lupe to cross into the United States with Carlos and Julia, she was forced to stay behind and to continue prostituting because she was making them money.
It's hard, right? It's hard to hear and it's hard to process. What was going on with Julia during this time before she had crossed when her mother was being forced into this situation?
Yeah, so there was a younger woman on the trip with them, and any time that Lupe needed to go or was forced to go, this younger woman would take care of Julia. And so I think in a lot of ways, Lupe really tried to protect Julia from even knowing that this was happening. Of course, some of it was clear and obvious, not in the sense of the sexual aspect of it, but the violence of it, because in the back of the tractor trailer, there were several men who were part of the Coyota band, and those men had guns, and they would fire them in the air, they would point them at people, they would force people to do things, and so quite a bit of it could not necessarily be hid from Julia. But as much as possible, Lupe was trying to protect her from seeing this happen.
I'm listening, and this is hard to process. As a scholar, yes, but really as a mother. Can you talk us through what happened next when they get to the border?
Yeah, so when they get to the border, the Coyota decides that Lupe is going to stay behind, and she allows Carlos, the stepdad, and Julia to cross over the river and to get picked up by Border Patrol. And so Lupe, for a while there, did not know what had happened, but was able to, I think a week or two afterwards, to see a video of Julia being picked up by Border Patrol. So Carlos and Julia then cross into the United States and go through a processing center. And at that processing center, the two are separated. What's somewhat unclear at this point is the zero tolerance policy is happening, and Carlos and Julia were separated immediately. If they were separated because the worry was that Carlos was not actually related to Julia, that would be strange because Julia is then placed into Carlos's sister's home through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so there are some people who have told me, well, they were worried that Carlos was trafficking her. Of course, his name was on her birth certificate. And then also, if that was the worry, why would they place her in his sister's home? So now as more and more reports come out about the zero tolerance policy, we know that it was actually happening prior to the official announcement. The zero tolerance policy was actually happening for a whole year between July of 2017 through June of 2018. And so with all of that knowledge now, it's pretty clear that the reason that she was separated so quickly from Carlos was because of the zero tolerance policy. And so that policy, basically anyone who came, whether they were seeking asylum or not, their children were taken from them and they were placed in separate facilities. So some of the children were placed in the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Some were considered unaccompanied minors. Some were placed in foster care. And the parents often were deported or sent to deportation facilities, just kind of depending on their situation.
And how did you get involved in fostering Julia?
So when an unaccompanied minor is placed into the sponsorship family home, is what it's called, they are still under ICE jurisdiction somewhat, and also under Office of Refugee Resettlement. What happened in Julia's case is when she was placed with Carlos's sister, she was then neglected at that home, which led her to then be placed into foster care. She was placed into Carlos's sister's home right about that same time. My family and I finally got our certificate to be foster parents. And so we were kind of going through that process, which takes a very long time. And our social workers knew that my husband and I had previously lived in Mexico. We both spoke Spanish. And so a couple of months later in February, when they got a call from police saying that there was a little girl wandering the streets who spoke only Spanish, they thought of us. And initially, the plan was just for her to be in DSS custody for the weekend. And the plan was on Monday to go to court and to have her, returned to ICE. But no one showed up in court. And so, again, because social workers knew we spoke Spanish and she didn't speak any English, we were the only family in the county at the time that had two parents who spoke Spanish. And so they asked if we would keep her in our home until we could kind of figure out her story. And so that's how she ended up with us in February.
I want to ask, at this point, Julia's been through a very traumatic experience. What was her state? I mean, how did you assess her state when she came to stay with you at the beginning?
Yeah, she had been through significantly more than I or social workers knew at the time. But again, we thought she was only going to be in our home for a weekend. And during that weekend, we had a lot of fun activities that just happened to be happening at the time. We had a birthday party in particular with a lot of family members. And we did not see much of the trauma come out that weekend. It wasn't until after no one showed up in court the following Monday that we started to see some of the trauma come out. And most of it was she tried to run away several times. She thought that if she left our house, she could run to her home in Honduras. And so there were several different things that we kind of had to work through, of course, one of which was simply to understand that her meltdowns were necessary. They just needed to happen in a safe environment. Because initially we tried to just prevent them from happening at all. And it turned into the most loving thing to do was to show her that she could melt down and that it was okay to do so, and that she would still be loved in the process and even after the meltdown. There was one time in particular where she decides that she's going to run away, and so I decide I'm going to go with her. So I'm walking around the neighborhood with her, and we're just talking, and I'm trying to show her that it's okay. But yeah, she had quite a bit to deal with, and we had, at that point in time, we needed to find a therapist who spoke Spanish, and that was a challenging thing to do. The social workers had never dealt with anything like this before. We're not a border town. We don't normally deal with these kinds of issues, and so it was a challenge to try to put all the pieces together to figure out what all was necessary, and even to know, half of the trauma that she had been through. A lot of it she never spoke about herself, and we were taught as foster parents not to bring it up or not to try to pry any of it out of her. And so much of it we actually didn't even know until after she had been reunited with her mom.
I have to imagine at 5, she's asking questions about her mom when she's living with you. Where's my mom, right? What did you tell her?
Yeah, the first, I think it was 11 days, if I remember correctly, before we were able to make contact with her mom. She knew that her mom, she thought that her mom was in Honduras back home. And I think it was right about the time when Julia came into our home that her mom had just returned to Honduras because her mom had escaped from the captors in Mexico. We were just telling her, like, we're trying to get in contact with your mom. And as soon as we do, we'll let you call her and talk to her. By the time we were able to have that first video call, it was a 3-hour long call, and they were so excited to see each other and so happy. So that was just a huge deal. And then, our family started to kind of mesh together in a very different and new way that certainly we did not expect to happen, signing up for foster parenting.
And how was Julia reconnected with her mother?
Once we made contact and had regular calls with Julia's mom, and then social workers were involved in this, of course, throughout the process. And so we had to figure out how to work the foster care system to reunite them. And in most cases, you have to prove to the judge that the parent is a good parent and that, they can handle taking care of their child again. In this particular case, it was a challenge to try to figure out how to even get a home study done. So we ended up having to work with the U.S. consulate from Honduras. We had to work with the family services group from Honduras to get the home study done. And then we had to get all of these different paperworks kind of filled out and figured out, and then present that to the judge at adjudication. And so when the judge ruled in her favor, by the time we were able to get all of that stuff, it wasn't until, so she came into our home in February. It wasn't until June when adjudication was able to happen for him to say, yes, let's reunite them. And then from there, it took several weeks to get all the paperwork for us to travel back with her because, of course, she didn't cross over with the passport. But thankfully, with the help of the Honduran consulate, we were able to piece all of the pieces together. And my husband and I were able to travel with her back to Honduras and see her reunited with her mom. And we got to stay with their family for a couple of days in Honduras before we came home.
What was that moment like when she was reunited with her mother?
It was an absolutely beautiful moment. It was one that we had waited, from the moment that we knew her mom was a good mom and this was not an abusive situation or a neglectful situation. We had been trying to get them reunited. And it took so much, and it took all these different people working together to make it happen. And when it finally happened 4 months later, of them being a total of 8 months apart, it was the most beautiful thing. We had heard all the stories of thousands of kids being separated from their parents and just feeling very shameful about my own country and what my country was doing. And so to stand in this place and to see this mother be reunited with her child in an honest and just way was just a wonderful moment to watch.
Yeah. So the book is also about your story, right? It's about Lupe's story. It's about Julia's story, but it's also about your story as a white Christian woman, evangelical Christian woman. How does your faith inform your perspective on all of this, on what happened, on immigration policies?
Yeah. When zero tolerance was happening, it felt strange that so many people of my faith were not standing up to say this was wrong. And again, just felt very shameful. My identity as an American, I felt shamed in. My identity as an evangelical, I felt shamed in. And just knowing, like, the faith that I have is because of Christ. And I am 100% confident that if Christ was living on earth right now and saw the zero tolerance policy happen, that he would be knocking down doors and shaking down and saying, this is not okay. This is not just. This is not right. We need to do everything that we can to make this right. And so in so many ways, my faith was shook because I didn't understand the people around me. And then as I would tell my story more and more, you started to see people's their minds kind of shift from this is a political story to, oh, this is real human beings. And that really was the desire for the book, was to share, like, this is a story of humanity. This is not a story of politics. And then just even as the story unfolds, to see Christ as a migrant mother was a new revelation for me. I certainly grew up with the mentality that God is not a woman, and not to say that God is, but there are a lot of female metaphors in the Bible that show God as a mother hen or a mother bear or all these different things. And so to see the love that Lupe had, to say to me, one of the first times that I talked to her, to say to me, if I come back to the border right now, will they give me my child back? And at the time, I didn't know her whole story. I didn't know that she went through as much trauma and prostitution as she did. And after writing the book and knowing the whole story, I would always just go back to that moment and say, what love is this? To be willing to go through such horrible situation again to get your child back, that is Christ.
I just want to sit with that moment for a second. So I think we hear a lot of stories in the news, and there's a lot of division, obviously, around the subject of immigration, and we've heard a lot of reporting about the stories of children and of families separated at the border. I think you have a unique perspective to speak on not just the trauma that Julia experienced in the kind of classic psychological ways we think of trauma, but what is the spiritual injury or harm that is done to a child like Julia from this process?
Wow. When she first came into our home, one of the things that was a struggle was her relationship with other men. It took her a long time to be around and to trust being around my husband. And again, there's so much of her particular trauma and story that I don't know. But then I got to see her around her brothers and got to see her being perfectly fine and comfortable to be around them. And, we talk about gender issues, and we talk about, just all the things that go along with that. And especially her growing up in Honduras, which is very patriarchal. I think some of the spiritual wounds that are happening in this story is that, from my perspective, most Christian men look at this as an issue of them needing to protect their own families and not seeing this as an issue of protecting and seeing other children as their own. There was a group of us women who were very outspoken on Twitter, really going up against this and saying, this is not okay. We will not look away. We cannot look away from this. We know what it's like to be moms. And if someone took our children, we would not handle this. This is not okay. But there were not very many men who did this. And that was all women led. And when I talk to Christian men often about this particular issue, it's often a topic of, well, I've got to protect what's mine. And I think that the spiritual wound is when we don't listen to women in this particular issue, what we see is, what we've seen in history is this is mine and I will protect what is mine, rather than seeing the midwives like Shiphrah and Puah who say, no, these are our children. This is our community. And I think women have a way of seeing that more naturally maybe than men do. And I think that this concept of protection, we're seeing this quite a bit in Christianity, like protect our nation, the nationalism that's going on. Instead of looking at this is mine and this is yours, can we look at these are our children, this is our humanity, and we're doing a disservice to these children because of that. And so for Julia to finally be back in a place where she can trust men again, and to know that she did before, right? Something happened along the way for her to not trust men, and to watch her grow in her trust of my husband was interesting to see. It wasn't expected.
Hi, this is Elaine here, and I've just been sitting here and processing this, and then one of the things I really love about the book, Gena, is that you wrestle with what, as a sociologist, I would call something like, I don't know, appropriation. You're a woman who's white and you're a mother, but you're also from a wealthy nation and have resources, and you are telling a brown person's story, a person who in this context doesn't have resources, and there's so many other dimensions of difference too, and yet there are things that draw you and Lupe together as well. Maybe just so our listeners can hear it in your own words, how do you think about, or how do you deal with that?
No, I think that's a great question. It's I think one of the ethical questions of this book. It feels like in a lot of ways that I'm telling someone else's story, and I have the connections to a publisher, connections to audiences, even now connections to this audience, telling Lupe's story. And it was very important to me, first of all, to make sure that it was okay with her for me to do this. And secondly, very important to make sure that I was telling her story as authentically as she wanted it to be told, and that I wouldn't share any details that she didn't want me to share. And so we went through some great lengths to try to make that happen, had pieces of the story translated back into Spanish after I translated it from her, to make sure that we were getting across what she wanted to get across. And I'm kind of, it depends on what day it is, I'm kind of on either side of that, because in some ways, this story needs to be told. I really do believe that, obviously. On other days, I think maybe I wasn't the one to tell it. Maybe it's not my story to tell. And even in the very end of the book, I have a little letter to Julia where I ask for her forgiveness if she ever decides that this is not the story that she wants to be told, or that me and her mom decided to tell her story.
I loved that, by the way. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely a tricky thing. And I mean, obviously the more and more we talk about this stuff, I think the better off we're going to be as a society. But I, as much as I possibly can, try to honor her and her story. And we continue to be in contact. We WhatsApp each other all the time. So she, she's aware of what's going on. And yeah, it's a tricky thing. It's a very tricky, intense thing. And I try, even in saying yes to talk at places, one of the things that I try to do is to make sure that, if I go to a conference or something, that it's not just me as a white woman being the only person talking about immigration, because I think that is an injustice. I don't have to stay on top of the news. I have the privilege of not having to do that, and I don't have to know what's going on. And in some ways, it's not my people, right? But in other ways, it is. And like I said, with Shiphrah and Puah, it is. We are each other's people. And so I do feel like the story needs to get told. I do feel great weight and privilege to be able to tell it. And all that I can do at this point is hope that I have honored the story as much as possible and continue to honor it in how I tell it on podcasts or in interviews as well.
This podcast is really about bringing women's voices to religion and public life. And what should we be doing? What should we be talking about to start fostering justice and compassion as virtues in our society more broadly?
Yeah, I love that about the podcast. I think that one of the biggest things that we can do as Christian women, and certainly as white Christian women, is to do a lot of self-reflection. I think that actually needs to be the first step. And in my own journey, it really took friendships and relationships with people of color to help me understand just how much privilege and power that I have as a white woman in America. And so I don't quite think that I can do a whole lot if I'm not aware, I guess, of how much that reflects in every aspect of my life. I do believe that I am an anti-racist racist as much as possible. So I do believe that the powers that have built this nation have put me in a particular place within it. And even though I try really hard to, in my work, knock down hierarchies that society has built up, those hierarchies are still there. And so it requires immense intentionality to recognize those hierarchies and to do my best to knock them down. And part of that requires almost a constant need to deal with offense. Because whether I want to or not, I offend people of color simply by thinking the way that I was taught to default think, or acting the way I was taught to act. And I think it's really important for us to recognize those issues and those concerns. If we really want to knock those pedestals down, we've got to understand that our society places us pretty high up on one, and we can't lift others up and push ourselves down until we recognize that. And I think that that's important. And I think one of the things that American culture teaches us is to constantly be climbing these rungs. And I think the gospel teaches us that it's just as good of news to go down than it is to go up. And unfortunately, most of our churches don't teach us that.
Kind of building off what Elaine asked and thinking about moving forward and where people go next. We recently had Sister Norma on the podcast, and I read in the book that you had also been to the border and you had met with Sister Norma. You had seen the work that she's doing, for example. And one of the things that Sister Norma has said, one of the things that other guests have said who worked on issues around the border is, your mind will change when you see what I've seen. And some on the show have gone so far as to say to people of faith and in congregations, come to the border and see what's happening. You know, do you agree with that sentiment? I mean, what do you think that would do to push this forward from your perspective, navigating these two different worlds?
Yeah, I think I remember hearing that on a recent podcast, and I do think it's important. I don't think it's everything. I think if we can come to the common ground that our humanity matters, that all humanity matters, then we can come to the common ground that we will work for immigration change and we will work for the rights of immigrants. I think that transformation happens through story listening. And so whether we listen to stories by reading books or listening to podcasts or watching movies or actually interviewing people, story has the power to transform us. And certainly proximity does a lot more. But story is a start. And I think that if more people read about what's happening at the border, then that desire to go will be even stronger. But I don't think it's necessary. I think plenty of people that haven't seen what's happening at the border can still get involved and still be passionate because they're passionate about what Christ has given us and the fact that the Imago Dei is on every human being in this world. I don't think we have to like people to fight for them. And I don't think that we necessarily have to see their faces to fight for them. I do think it's important. I think it's potent. And I think it's wonderful when people are able to do that. But especially right now in the COVID era, it's really complicated to do that. And I don't think that's an excuse to not get involved.
I want to pick up on that line you just said. We don't have to like people to fight for them. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is Austin Channing Brown influence right here. She had said something that just really struck me, something to that effect, that, if you wait until you become friends to fight for someone's right, then if the friendship ends, are you still going to fight for their right to be a human being? And I think that's really telling. Relationships and proximity, again, they are a lot. They mean a lot. And I don't want to downplay what they are. But I do think that there is in every Christian theology this sense that we fight for humanity. That is the calling that we have on us because we have been given that same calling and that revelation by Christ himself. And so when we truly believe that the image of God is imprinted on every human being, then we fight for the rights of every human being. We fight for life. And I don't want to have an excuse that says, well, I've fallen out of relationship with these people, and so I then can't fight for them. Well, relationship does not predispose humanity. You're human first. I can treat you as a human, whether I want to be your friend or not. And I hope that you will do the same for me. And I hope that you'll fight for me, whether you like my haircut, whether you like the way I talk or not. Like, let's fight for each other because this is what it means to be a human being. And this is who Christ was.
That leads me to the next question because it connects with something you wrote about in the book. And it's this idea that salvation doesn't have to just be individual. We can have communal salvation. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so this ties back to this Hebrew concept of shalom and even the concept of justice. So it's obviously in the United States and certainly in Western culture, there is an emphasis on individualism. And I grew up in church and I grew up being taught that salvation is individual. And really, in a lot of ways, the whole you pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and all that kind of stuff. And so much of that, I think now as we're putting a magnifying glass on a nationalism, we can start to see that some of those things that we thought were biblical or Christian are actually just quite American. And so in so many ways, our culture has co-opted our faith. But in communal societies, you care about each other's kids. You take care of each other's kids. So, when my son was born in Mexico and we were living in Mexico, I had at least 20 women telling me every week what I should be doing with my son, right? And that's just normal. And so his health and his well-being in some ways felt like their responsibility as much as it felt like mine. And I think that we need to capture that more in the States especially. It's certainly talked about throughout the Bible. Israel was a community of people, and salvation, which means wholeness, is a communal thing. If I feel whole, but the only reason I feel whole is because I'm stepping on your back, that's not salvation. That's not actual wholeness. That's my perception of wholeness, but it's actually my selfishness. And so your flourishing and my flourishing together create our communal salvation.
Gena, I'm listening to you talk and I'm thinking, why isn't your voice louder? Why do I always hear men when I hear about evangelical Christianity? And I'm not, in the faith, but I'm listening a lot to the news and I'm hearing a lot of male voices right now.
Right.
How do you reconcile, or how do you reckon with that?
I'm sitting here thinking the same thing, Pamela, and I'm really glad you said it. I was just thinking to myself, wow, this is the best representation we could get. And why is this story not I'm not putting you on a pedestal. I'm not saying, I know, and we know, like, none of us are perfect, but I wish this voice were more widely amplified, is how I would put it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think I'm part of a denomination who is okay with women pastors, not just okay, but my particular church congregation has a female pastor. But even within the denomination, there's plenty of people who don't think it's okay. I don't understand that. I fight against that quite a bit, and I don't really understand, and I think even among those of us who are egalitarian Christians, there's still a huge culture to change to say that even this is okay. I don't know. I don't know, but I appreciate all the women who fight for it, because it's a hard road to battle.
This feels like a little bit of a bland question after what we've just been talking about, but Pam and I are both educators, and we want to help those who are learning, know, from your perspective, what should people be reading if they want to think more about the border, if they want to think more about justice and faith and immigration? Who are the people you're reading, or who would you suggest that our listeners read?
Yeah, there's a long list of books in my book, in chapter 10, that talk through different aspects of immigration and what books to read specific to that. But I would definitely say, again, kind of from the stance of I'm a white woman writing this book, try to find stories that are not written by white people, specifically on immigration. There are several out there, and they're very powerful. And I think it's important that we listen to those voices as well.
That's great. Thank you, Gena. This is really a really powerful experience for me, just to read your book, and even more so to talk to you. So thanks for who you are.
I feel the same. I feel a tremendous privilege that we're able to talk with you, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you both. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. The Religion and Public Life program is on Twitter at RiceRPLP. Thank you again to our guest, Gena Thomas. Today's show was written by Haley Hemstreet, Rachel Schneider, Elaine, and myself. Our producers are Three Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Pamela Prickett. Until next time.